cow, which is a ruminant, or a deer, which is a ruminant, they have 4 separate stomachs which are doing that fermentation inside their body. So this really neat creation that God gave us, which are these animals that can take grass and turn it into a very clean food for themselves, and then become a very clean food for us. Jesus said it is not what goes into a person, it just comes out of a person that makes them unclean. By far, the biggest thing is these vegetable oils. What we think of as processed foods are almost always made with these vegetable oils, and that's what's causing the most harm from them. And avoiding these, this is the number one priority in my diet from a health perspective.
Welcome to the Born Unstoppable podcast. In this episode, I had the privilege of having a conversation with Kat Owens, who is a functional nutritional therapy practitioner and a certified personal trainer. She's passionate about exploring nutrition from a biblical perspective, and she believes that food is not just a simple topic, but can provide insights about God and what we should be eating. Throughout our conversation, we dove deep into the misconceptions surrounding food, the benefit of meat, the importance of preparing certain plants before eating them, and the overall impact of dietary choices on our health, and also how we can approach nutrition from a biblical lens. This is an episode for everyone, regardless of your religious beliefs. So get ready to learn about biblical nutrition with Kat Owens. Before this podcast starts, I have a small favor to ask of you. Over the last couple of episodes, over 97% of people watching these videos did not subscribe to the channel. My goal is to reduce that to 50% one day. And if you've ever liked anything on this channel, please do me a quick favor, hit that subscribe button, like the videos, and share it. It helps this channel a lot more than you know. Thank you and enjoy the episode. And I'd like to emphasize that this podcast is separate from my role as a family medicine resident at the University of Toronto at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Barrie, and I may cover topics that aren't fully aligned with the CPSO, our governing body of physicians here in Ontario. It is, however, part of my desire to bring awareness and information as it relates to improving health and other aspects of life at a zero cost to the general. All right, Kat, thank you for joining the podcast. I'm excited to get to chat about the biblical perspective of nutrition. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I love getting to talk about this.
Yeah, I'm excited. As we were chatting briefly, there's quite a few people interested in hearing what the Bible has to say, what God has to say about how we can approach nutrition for health, and just to really, I think, honor God and honor Scripture in how we eat and how we take care of our bodies. And it can be kind of confusing nowadays with experts from both sides sharing contradicting ideas. So it's nice to have Scripture to kind of look back on, although it's not specifically always giving us like a recipe or exactly what to say. We can reflect and extrapolate a little bit about what God mentions to Israel and such for health. So I like to start the podcast with a couple of rapid fire questions. So keep your answers nice and brief, just to kind of, so people can get to know you a little bit better and nice and fast. And then we'll jump into, then you can introduce yourself. Okay.
Sorry.
Where did you grow up?
Let's see. Mostly in Idaho. Moved around a bit, but that's usually what I say.
And where do you live now?
Right now we are in New Jersey. We're stationed here with the Air Force, so this is temporary.
Oh, fun. I saw on your website, so both of you, your husband and you, were in the Air Force or are in the Air Force?
Yes, I'm still a reservist. My husband's active duty.
Fun. I got to learn how to use the Microsoft 2020 simulator this past weekend. And I was doing the Top Gun Maverick flying around with the F-18 as a video with the simulator.
That's great.
What's one of your favorite books?
One of my favorite books is Joel Salatin's The Marvelous Bigness of Pigs. Kind of an odd title, but he touches on a lot of what I love to talk about, probably what we'll be talking about today. He's one of the only people who I think is really talking about food, raising food well from a biblical perspective, and he just does it fantastically.
Okay, cool. I've never heard of it, so I'll have to write it down and maybe take a look at it in the future. Do you have a favorite Bible verse?
You know, I think, especially when I'm thinking about this topic, food and nutrition, I really love 2 Corinthians 4:18. It says, as we look not to the things that are seen, but the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient and the things that are unseen are eternal. I'm always trying to remind myself and pray to stay focused on that eternal perspective. I think when we're talking about food, that's important, but in everything we do, it's easy to get caught up in these things that are right in front of us. And all of it, food, everything we do, we can be looking at it from that eternal perspective.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And what's one of your superpowers, if you were to say one?
I think I can think of good creative solutions, and I think that's what has allowed me to have a lot of the opportunities that I've had and accomplish. Some of my work is slow going, but being able to get it done while I'm also staying at home and taking care of my kid. A lot of it is, not getting stuck thinking, things have to be done a certain way because that's how they've always been done, but thinking of creative ways to do more and to do different things.
Good. Yeah, it's very important to be able to look at things from different perspectives to accomplish the goal. And what do you feel is holding people back from finding success in nutrition?
It's a good question because there's a lot of that, and a lot of people trying different things and not necessarily getting the results that they want. I think probably the biggest problem I see is people getting caught up in dogmatic ideas that come from advertising, that come from our culture, that just come from catchphrases we hear all the time. Things like processed food or fast food without really knowing the why behind it. Or they get caught up seeing, advertisement says this is gluten free and it makes it think, well, that maybe that's what makes food healthy or something. And we've really got to understand the why behind it and make sure that what we believe and what we're doing for ourselves and our families is it makes sense from a biblical worldview. It's backed up by good science, and that it also makes sense in terms of human history. That's what I'm really trying to get people back to.
Okay. Yeah. One thing that came to mind now, my goal, so you're the first person I've had on to talk about biblical nutrition. Like we said, there's not many people talking about it. So before we jump, thanks for answering the rapid fire questions, and we'll definitely touch on some of those things you just mentioned. Before we jump into your intro, just so you can share more about who you are, I just want to take a couple seconds just to pray. I think it'd be very nice to start off the podcast and pray for God's wisdom during our conversation. Okay. Lord, thank you so much for our lives today, that we can live and breathe and have this conversation. Thank you that we are interested in nutrition, that you've given us food that tastes good. And there's a lot of healthy food and there's unhealthy food, Lord, as humans have kind of contaminated and made a lot of processed things, Lord. We just ask that you give us wisdom to be able to discern what is healthy and what is nutritious, and just respect your word and not read in too much of our current culture into your word, but really just look at it for what your Holy Spirit intended it, and try to take out the nuggets of wisdom and apply it to our lives. And we pray that we would be changed, that we would look at creation with awe, and that we would take care of your animals, your plants, Lord, your world, and revere it well. And that we'd be able to just glorify you through how we eat, how we think, and how we talk, Lord. And pray you bless this conversation, and bless those listeners who are listening, taking time out of their day to try to improve their health, regardless if they agree with what we talk about, with your scripture, with your word, or disagree, Lord. Just pray you bless everyone. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. That's great.
All right. So tell us, how did you get to the point where you are now?
Yeah, so I first got introduced to this world of nutrition, like a lot of people do, which was just through my own experiences. So after college, I started having nothing major, really common stuff, unfortunately, just some digestive problems, low blood sugar problems, and figured out pretty quickly that the conventional medical approach, what you get just going to most doctors, it's unfortunately very acute focused, which is not doesn't always have the best tools for these kind of chronic things that people are dealing with so much now. So I just figured out really quickly that I needed to start learning about this, and I needed to start taking care of this on my own and figuring it out for myself. So that's when I started doing a lot of research, started just reading a lot, listening to a lot of podcasts, and found out too that I just loved researching this, learning about it, and was able to start experimenting, getting some good answers and solutions to the problems I was having, but also just loved learning about it. So I started off at first actually writing a little blog about food and alternative medicine from a Christian perspective. And, I look back now, I've come a long ways, but it was fun at the time. And that was kind of the first thing I was trying to do, not just learning, but putting something out there. And since then, I got my certification as a nutritional therapy practitioner, and then spent time really focusing on some other areas. So I was really focused on keto and trying to work with people for weight loss with keto for a while. And I was really into researching and working with the carnivore thing for a while. And then it's been neat that more recently I've come back to this biblical perspective. And that's always been a foundation for me with what I've been doing. But I realized that this is my favorite thing to talk about when it comes to nutrition. And I think it's also where there's not a lot of other people talking about this. And there's a good little niche of people who are very interested in it, which is really encouraging. And I think I'm optimistic that the church has a lot more potential to embrace this and to find solutions to a lot of the things that Christians are suffering from, just like the rest of the world. And I think we really have the opportunity to live differently. So what I'm doing now is I'm teaching some classes I love being able to go and teach to small groups like from a church. Church groups are just a group of women that are interested in this topic. Recently went to a couple conferences, and I'm working now on some lesson materials that could be used to teach classes, or that even other people could use to go and teach classes. Because there's people out here who want to go educate their Christian friends and community about this kind of thing themselves, and they already know a lot about it themselves. And so I want to be able to help with that as well.
Yeah, that would be extremely beneficial. I know I would benefit from having whatever your curriculum is, right, to walk people through. I know we have a Bible study here, not related to nutrition, but nutrition comes up because I'm interested in it. So we have good conversations, and I think having something to use as a reference, as a backbone, and you've done all the research. Like I have just passive learning, right? Not active learning of diving into the Bible and all the other research for health. And so I know I would benefit from that, and our church would benefit from it. And I really appreciate you sharing that. When you started learning, you went from, health usually stems, or our interest in health usually stems from like a personal interest, right? We all kind of have something. So we're like, God dang it, we're going to try and improve this. And so you went keto, and then a natural evolution from there is carnivore. And then you're like, okay, is this right? And you kind of have to kind of balance it. And I find myself caught in a similar situation where I guess keto was the more popular one, more research, the older one, and then carnivore came on the scene. And me being a family doctor or resident right now, I have to really be careful with any extreme views that I have. I love carnivore. I would love to eat meat all day if I could financially afford like the best cuts. But I also appreciate a little bit of everything. My wife and we still eat a good variety diet. And it's interesting to see the extremes or the dogma that exists in all the camps. When I just released a podcast with Dr. Zoe Harcombe, and my thumbnail says debunking the myth of fiber, and I got a lot of comments coming at me or Dr. Zoe Harcombe about, why fiber is so good. And I'm like, I have nothing personally against fiber. Like, we still eat our veggies, but I think we have to push back a little bit on the extreme stance of what the current guidelines say and what people push and doctors push of like, you need fiber. You can't live without it. Like, if you don't have it, you're going to worsen your health. And what the term that comes to me when we learned about quality improvement projects is that the strongest way to make sure that people make change is called a forced function, right? So that's like number one in terms of making change. And I see a lot of healthcare in regards to nutrition forcing people, right, meatless Mondays, to make that change against their wills. And so eat your vegetables. They're good for you. They can be good for you. They can also be bad for you. But when people start forcing it on others, that's when I think a lot of people start kicking back. And then there's others that just don't like veggies, regardless of what you say and the experience. But that's fine. Everybody can choose to believe and eat whatever they want.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm still a big fan of carnivore in keto for certain situations. But one of the really cool things that I learned the more I study nutrition from a biblical perspective is that God gave us food to be enjoyable, and the best foods for us really are going to be enjoyable. And I just keep seeing more and more how much our culture has this belief that the healthiest foods for us are going to be the ones that are bland and boring and not enjoyable. It's like, you got to cut out all the fat, you got to cut out all the sugar, you got to eat these high fiber, bland foods. And the more I learn that I just want to push back against all of that. And I don't think even scientifically, the more I learn, I don't think that's true. But then that also means that, I think learning why carnivore works, we can learn that I think most people can get most all of the benefits without having to cut everything out. You just have to understand why it actually works.
Yeah. And before we it would be nice to hear that nuance soon. But before we jump into that, can you share a little bit about what is biblical nutrition and why would it be important or beneficial for us to view nutrition from a biblical lens?
That's a great question, because I think a lot of Christians are actually a little bit resistant to talk about this topic because nutrition and food in our bodies, they're not eternal, right? And so we're focusing on something that is transient. It is passing. And then I think there's also some beliefs in the Christian community about, we need to be relying on God for our health and our healing, not trying to take this all into our own hands. And then there's even just this kind of, I think it's a little outdated at this point, but still this perspective that anything to do with health food and caring about the environment, that it's, earth worshiping hippies, and some people just want to stay completely away from that and don't want anything to do with it. So when I'm talking about biblical nutrition, what I'm talking about is Christians, we eat every day. We make decisions about food every day, right? Why would we take something that's that big of a part of our life and try to completely separate it from our biblical worldview? It's not a spiritually neutral topic. Food is absolutely not a spiritually neutral topic. There's so much we can learn about God. There is so much that we can benefit from by looking to the Bible to help inform us about what is the best thing we can be eating. And I'm always very, very clear that this is not about saying, I don't believe that there is any biblical mandates that say for a Christian, food is moral. This is not a moral topic. This isn't saying it's morally wrong to eat anything. But almost everybody is putting some amount of effort into trying to eat healthy already, even if it's just following some vague concept of what they think a diet of moderation is, right? So you're already putting some effort into this. Most people, unfortunately, are already dealing with some kind of health issues, and it doesn't have to be that way. And like you already mentioned, we don't have a lot of real clear direction in the Bible that says this is healthy, this is what you should be eating, whether it's from a moral or even just a beneficial standpoint. But just approaching from a biblical worldview, we have the potential to be doing so much better than most people in the world are doing today. And that's what I want to be able to show brothers and sisters.
Hmm. And so what does scripture say? Like what are some verses that you like to touch on to show where God has led Israel and has provided information for us to kind of learn from as well?
Yeah, I love that question. So I love to start in Genesis and talk about, for one thing, two things from the very beginning of Genesis. First, that God's creation is good. That means we should really expect that God gave us everything we need for good health in creation. And that's probably a little bit more obvious one. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the more natural something is, the better it's going to be. I think
Mm.
that actually comes more from a purely evolutionary worldview. If you really think that we are the same as animals, we are, there's no purpose for us on this earth, we're just random chance, we're basically just smarter monkeys, then it makes sense to look back and say, well, what were our ancestors millions of years ago eating? What were apes eating when they evolved to humans? And you can come to the conclusion then that, maybe a paleo diet's the best diet, or maybe even a raw food diet. Maybe humans shouldn't be cooking their food, right? Whether you believe in young earth or old earth creation, the point is that in Genesis, we see that God very clearly created humans set apart from animals. And this is the second thing I like to point out in Genesis, with the purpose of having dominion over earth, dominion over
Mm.
animals, but also over earth and his creation. And even just what we see in the garden, that it was ordered and humans put work into taking God's creation and, I don't know if improving upon it is the right word, but ordering it, using it, taking it, transforming it into something else that can be beneficial for us and God's creation. And that is missed in nutrition a lot. And what I mean by that is, we shouldn't be just eating a raw food diet. Cooking food is a way of having dominion over it, even processing it, if you want to use that really loaded word. But even, grains, this is a really big one, right? The paleo diet, keto, all these people are recognizing that there's a lot of problems with our grains today. And a lot of people do really well by completely cutting those out, right? And I avoided all grains for a very long time. So I understand all the criticisms against grains. I agree with them. But what is missed is the fact that the biggest problem with our grains today is that we are no longer preparing them using traditional preparation methods. These God-given traditional preparation methods, which, oh, by the way, we see examples of in the Bible a lot. The Bible talks a lot about leavening bread and all these things. And if we just take grains and use those traditional preparation methods, it's almost like it's a completely different food. You don't have to cut grains out of your diet to be healthy. You just have to learn what does good dominion over a grain look like? And it's almost completely lost today. So
Right.
that concept of dominion, that can apply to processed foods. How do we figure out what really are the bad processed foods? What's good processing over foods? There's a lot that could be said about that. But then you mentioned Israel, God's people. They got some pretty specific direction about food, right? With the dietary laws in Leviticus. And a really important thing, I love to point this out to people, really interesting thing we see from that is, and I mentioned so many different topics here. I'm going to go into this one a little bit, and if there's more that we should talk about any of these, of course, bring it up. But I will do love to bring this up. So the very first food in the dietary laws that God specifically tells his people to eat, it says animals with a cloven hoof and that chew their cud. It sounds really random, and a lot of people do just assume that these dietary laws were random. There was no purpose to them other than just to test God's people, right? But there was a lot more to it than that. There was a reason for all of these. So what that command was doing is it's distinguishing ruminants from grass-eating animals that are not ruminants. A ruminant is an animal that eats grass, and it has 4 separate stomachs which allow it to take that grass and essentially process it into a good food. I just mentioned like processing grains well. One of these things we can do to grains to make them a much better food is fermentation. Well, a cow, which is a ruminant, or a deer, which is a ruminant, they have 4 separate stomachs which are doing that fermentation inside their body. So this really neat creation that God gave us, which are these animals that can take grass and turn it into a very clean food for themselves, and then become a very clean food for us. So the dietary laws basically start out saying ruminants are animals you should eat. So how does that apply to us today? Well, what's a ruminant? A cow, a sheep, a goat, a deer, elk, bison. The important thing to understand about all of those is all of those are what we would call red meat. And that also means that they have the most saturated fat. So we hear all this stuff now about red meat is bad, saturated fat is bad. Well, the very first animals that God told his people to eat, and made it very clear too that these laws were for their good. It was to keep them healthy. It was to make them a set-apart nation. Ruminants were the ones they should be eating. The red meat, the saturated fat, the animals with the most fat too. All these animals they were told not to eat, like carnivores, those are very lean meat. Ruminants are very high in fat compared to other animals, and very high in saturated fat. So it's just very hard to imagine that everything we hear now about red meat and about saturated fat, how can that be true when we know that these are the animals that God gave his people? And that's not even getting into the science and the human history aspect, which I love too as well, which I think supports all that as well. That these are good foods to be eating, or foods we should be eating.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And I do have a couple of questions just to touch on there. When you mentioned ruminants, I think a common question or concern people share are, at least for the CAFOs, like the grain finished and not properly raised beef, is should we be concerned about antibiotics absorbed maybe through the meat, and also glyphosate? Those are some of the common kind of criticisms when it comes to that, aside from maybe some of the environmental issues and fat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that people are thinking about those things. And as Christians, I think we should care about animal welfare. We should care about the environment. And there's some good Bible verses that back that up. Unfortunately, like I mentioned earlier, we do kind of have this culture of Christians saying, oh, I don't want to be putting animals on the same level as humans. I don't want to be worshiping creation. And so they just reject all of that. But we should be caring about these things. And so we can obviously eat good meat that does not come from a cow that comes from a confinement feeding operation, or that is not eating, I don't know, grass that's sprayed with glyphosate. I'm not even sure that's exactly a concern, but food that's sprayed with glyphosate, for example. We can certainly go and find those much better foods out there, and I think there's good health and even biblical reasons to care about that. The really neat thing about ruminants, though, is that they are such good processors of what they eat that if a cow is eating an unnatural diet, which is what we would see in a CAFO, these animals just being fattened up on the wrong kind of grains and all kinds of other junk, leftover baked goods and candy, and it just even parts of other cows, at least the fat from other cows. Don't really feed cows other cow meat anymore since the mad cow disease, but they still do get like the fat from other cows. All kinds of things they're not supposed to be eating, right? Well, the neat thing is that cows are actually such good processors of what they eat that actually very little of that comes through to you if you're eating conventional beef. And so what I think is actually most unfortunate is that people hear about all these concerns. Oh, the cows are eating grain fed. They're eating candy. Because of that, I'm not going to eat beef anymore. And that is the wrong way to go about it. If I really think the first thing we can concentrate on is just our own health. No one else is doing that for you. That's it. You've got to start with that. And I really think you do need red meat in your diet to be getting good nutrient density, the best kind of fat you can be getting. And if all you can get is conventional beef, you're still 99% of the way there.
Yeah.
It is really, from a health perspective, conventional beef is not anywhere near one of my biggest concerns. In fact, other kinds of meat like pork and chicken, they're not as good processors of what they eat. And it's much, much harder to find chicken and pork that is being fed a good diet. It's fairly easy to go find 100% grass-fed beef, but real pastured pork, pastured chicken that's not getting corn or soy and other junk, actually very hard to find. So
True.
If you are removing beef from your diet because you're concerned about the quality, but then you're going to eat more chicken and pork instead, or you're eating less meat instead, that's not helping your health. And I'm actually, conventional beef is not one of my biggest concerns. And I don't think people should be concerned about that from a health perspective, as maybe they are. I do buy grass-fed beef whenever I can. We usually get a half cow from a local ranch. But if I run out of that and I go to the store, I don't even always pay more for the grass-fed beef. And there's some other issues there that doesn't always, that's not always actually a good option, which is why I don't worry about that too much. But I definitely don't eat less beef if that's the only option I have.
Yeah. I noticed a couple of my patients, I like to touch on nutrition and diet with most of my patients where possible.
Which is great.
And yeah, so some of them will say that haven't eaten red meat or they eat red meat every 6 weeks. I was like, whoa, that's crazy. But then one person said, I haven't eaten red meat in 40 years. And I'm like, whoa, that's even crazier. And I it's an N of 2, but typically the patients that say that have some autoimmune or digestive issues and could benefit from eating more red meat. I don't touch it. I don't touch on that topic or I don't push it too much unless you're interested. I did try to dispel some of the myths that were brought up. Just be like, hey, I don't think that's really true. Like you don't have to be afraid of red meat. It can be beneficial. But at the same point, it's everybody's personal decision to put in their body what they want. And I just try to give them what I see from research and experience is truth and let them make that decision.
Well, I'm so happy medical doctors are talking about that.
Yeah, I think more and more are. Still not a lot, especially older doctors and maybe even younger. Like, honestly, if you have to be somewhat interested in nutrition to take that time to educate patients, because it's honestly not really worth it. In a 15-minute conversation, there's so much to tackle, and usually medications can be the answer that unless you're knowledgeable about the topic, you're just going to kind of be throwing, eat healthy, eat less, move more, Canadian food guidelines. And it's going to stop at that. It's going to be like decrease your fat, decrease your animal protein. And that's going to be counterintuitive. So it's almost best people don't give nutritional advice if they're going to be saying that. But because I like learning about it, I'm interested talking to experts on this topic. I feel a little bit more confident when I make suggestions and have a good conversation. Like I ask my patients, like, what do they think about it? Where do they agree or disagree? And a lot of them find benefit in me taking some time to chat with them. One thing that I wanted to touch on, you mentioned there are ways that we use to process grains that most people don't. So would you be able to share briefly what are some of the kind of common grains that people eat and how can we improve processing them?
Yeah. And so the problem with grains, any seed, grains are seeds, right, is that these are parts of the plant that are highly defended against insects, against even just trying to protect the seed itself so that it can go germinate again. So what that means for us when we eat a seed or a grain is that it is really high in what are known as anti-nutrients. These are compounds like lectins, phytic acid, even gluten. And those are known to bind to other nutrients and minerals in our diet and keep you from absorbing them. Even very significant amounts, depending on what combination of anti-nutrient and nutrient you're looking at. You could essentially not be absorbing any of that nutrition because of the anti-nutrients present in the grain or the seed. But also can be really hard on your digestive system and can lead to these kind of digestive problems long term, which of course are going to affect all kinds of other things in your body. So the point of these traditional preparation methods is to lessen the activity of these anti-nutrients in the grain. And so if we look back at traditional cultures, how people all around the world were preparing their foods kind of before the Industrial Revolution is probably the big turning point. They were almost always preparing their grains through some kind of preparation method that maybe they didn't understand the science of it the same way we do, but what it was doing was it was reducing those anti-nutrients. So what we're talking about here is fermentation. So for example, a wild sourdough yeast fermentation, that is going to take the lectins and even the gluten in bread and reduce a lot of that, make it a much more easy to digest food, one that's going to help you get more nutrition from the bread itself, but also other foods you're eating with the bread. Rice, I'm a big fan of soaking rice, soaking it with a little bit of something acidic like apple cider vinegar or maybe overnight. So soaking, fermentation, there's a process called nixtamalization, which is a traditional preparation method for corn where it's soaked with lime water, not lime juice, but like the base. And that is going to, reduce those anti-nutrients. It makes the B vitamins, what we know now, makes some of those B vitamins much more available. And it's so interesting that Native Americans did this process all the time. And it was the only way that they prevented really acute B vitamin deficiencies. And, they didn't understand the science of that, like I said, the same way we do, but somehow their intuitive wisdom, this generational wisdom they had, they knew that was how you had to prepare corn to be able to eat it.
That's very neat.
So we see fermentation, soaking, sprouting is another one. All over the world, this was how people prepared their grain. And today, that's almost completely lost. We just take it and cook it and eat it. And I think that is the biggest problem with the grains we're eating today.
Yeah, I'm guilty. I don't soak my rice, but I think I will. I'll start soaking my rice earlier.
Right. It's an easy step. You take some planning ahead.
Yeah, and I appreciate you sharing that. I think when people hear this, I hope that everybody listening is open to eating both vegetables or plants and meat. And hopefully the people who are benefit from carnivore at least see the benefits from these traditional ways or preparation ways, right? So that we can eat plants in a healthier manner to absorb most of the nutrients, and vice versa for those who maybe don't like meat. The other thing that I want to just touch on is you're mentioning, so ruminants tend to be leaner, or I guess fatter meats, I think that you said before.
Yeah.
And it's good to, and Dr. Zoe Harco mentioned that about from like a steak, ribeye steak, for example, is only 7% saturated fat, roughly. And so it's not that much saturated fat, but I guess it is more than certain other foods. And I say that only because a lot of people think that, you eat a steak and you're going to be overwhelmed with saturated fat. And it's like, no, it's only 7%. And you absorb a lot of it, but you also don't absorb 100% of it, depending on what you eat with it. And the good thing that you mentioned, eating like grass-fed ruminants, and if you hunt and they're not near a lot of corn farms, then they eat more their traditional diet, right? And those do tend to be a little bit leaner and probably have the appropriate portion of fat to muscle ratio that they were designed to. Once we get into the CAFOs and just grain fed, if they're mostly grain fed or even grain finished, then they tend to have more fat. And so I think it's good to keep that in mind, that maybe if we're eating these more conventional beefs, if there is a lot of fat, to trim away some of it. I personally don't too much unless it's like a really disproportionate steak. I like to have like top sirloin with a cap hole, and so there's a big fatty piece
Hmm.
on top, and sometimes it's just like a huge chunk of fat and a little bit of meat. In that case, I trim some of it, but I try to eat all the fat that comes with the meat because it was designed to be eaten that way, and it is very good. All you need is salt on a barbecue for a steak like that, and it tastes good. You don't need to add anything else.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I'm not too worried
yeah.
about people eating too much animal fat. Used to,
Hmm.
people were eating a lot more of the organ meat, which had a lot of the fat in them. And that's what we're kind of missing out on now is traditional cultures would have actually gone and prioritized like the liver or the
Yeah.
brain that had a lot of fat in it. And today we're probably just eating more of the fat that maybe is there because the cow was fattened up on grain instead.
Yeah, that's true. Like I hear stories from like Dr. Saladino and people who've been to the Hadza tribe and they eat the monkey brains and brains made out of cholesterol and they find
Hmm.
benefit in that. So I wish I liked liver. So I don't, and I sometimes have like a liver capsule and things like that. But I should look into more recipes to incorporate more organ meats throughout my day.
Yeah, I take desiccated organ supplements because I do not like the taste either. But it's very
Yeah,
interesting how fast those tastes can change because my toddler loves organ meat. He actually loves
good.
taking my desiccated organ tablets and biting them open and eating the powder out. She just loves the taste
Oh,
of it because I think
okay.
she was introduced to that early, which most of us
Yeah.
never were.
Yeah, you got to start them young. Get those taste buds wired right. Would you mind explaining the bias in the background between like of why there is so much conflict or hatred towards red meat? Historically,
Mm,
why that came about?
yes, I love talking about this. So most people would think that it's just purely scientific, right? The science came out at some point and said saturated fat's bad for you, so we stopped eating it. Um, but if we look back at the history of avoiding meat, demonizing saturated fat, originally it was actually all very religious. Came from different types of religious backgrounds. So even the first vegetarian diets we see, this existed in ancient Hinduism, Jainism. That's really the first instance of any kind of vegetarian diet we see in human history. Um, and then, of course, throughout church history, there were different kinds of lean days that the Catholic Church instituted. And a lot of that there was political reasons for that. But I think what we've always seen is that there is this human temptation to try to achieve whether it's salvation or other religions' version of enlightenment or even just some kind of righteousness. There's this human temptation to try to achieve that through self-denial.
Mm,
And meat is a really easy target of that because food is something we eat every day. I mean, obviously we eat every day, but we've always kind of had this human intuition that meat is satisfying, it's satiating, it helps you grow strong and keeps you healthy. Um, these people that were facing it wasn't the overabundance of food we have today. It was, starvation or getting enough food. They really intuitively knew that meat was, you needed this to stay healthy and it was the best tasting food. So I think there's always been this temptation to try to achieve this kind of righteousness through cutting things out of our lives. And meat has always been a really easy target. So what we see a little more recently in history is here in the United States, um, around the time of the Great Awakening, we had these new kind of religious sects of Christianity popping up. The temperance movement was really big, which was mostly focused on alcohol, but it
mm,
really had this aesthetic focus more than just alcohol. So
mm,
asceticism, this really just means trying to achieve some kind of righteousness through self-denial. That's what I think of that as. And so we see this, especially with the temperance movement. and these religious sects that were coming out of the Great Awakening. And so you have at this time this Presbyterian, I believe he was Presbyterian preacher, might be wrong. It was some denomination of Christianity. Preacher Sylvester Graham, very influenced by the temperance movement, and he's kind of known as the father of vegetarianism in the United States. He was preaching this bland, eat these bland grains, don't eat meat, very kind of self-denial type diet, obviously no alcohol or, these other satisfying foods like that. And kind of preaching that this was the way to be healthy, but it really had this religious backbone that comes back to this asceticism. And then, not long after that, we have the Seventh Day Adventist Church, which came out of this Great Awakening. And this has had a massive influence on our food and our beliefs about food. So they had very similar beliefs to this man, Sylvester Graham. And they came out talking about how we needed to avoid meat and these other fine foods in order to live this moral life, in order to avoid sexual temptation specifically. And the Seventh Day Adventists and Sylvester Graham, they tied this back to the Garden of Eden and said, people in the Garden of Eden weren't eating meat. So this was the original human diet designed by God. And so obviously this is the best way we should be eating. And so the Seventh Day Adventists took this, ended up inventing a lot of the foods that are still major parts of the American diet. They invented breakfast cereals. The intention with that was that it was actually the breakfast cereal was supposed to replace the standard American breakfast at that time, which was usually eggs and some kind of meat. And they said, get rid of that, replace it with this bland grain. They didn't have all the sugar in the cereal at the time. They were supposed to be bland, boring grains. They were the first to really market nut butters. The purpose of that was to replace real butter. They invented the first fake meat, really were a big part of bringing the soy industry to America, making things like tofu a big replacement for meat. And there are a lot of food companies now, very common food companies that you would recognize now. Little Debbie, Post, Kellogg, many others. You would recognize all of these that were started by Seventh Day Adventists or still owned by the Seventh Day Adventist Church. And they're all about replacing meat and animal-based foods in the diet with these grain and plant-based alternatives. And it's turned into now a lot of what we would think of as processed foods, but they're still meeting that original intention, really. And they've also had a huge influence on our dietary guidelines, even what the government is advocating. And when Ancel Keys came along in the mid-1900s, and he was the first one who really came out with this science implicating saturated fat in heart disease. He was influenced by all these ideas and had what we know now was not a good scientific study, but he took his scientific study and came out and said saturated fat is the problem. There was a lot of fear about heart disease at that time. The President Eisenhower just had a heart attack, and he came out and said, this is the problem. We got to get rid of the saturated fat. From that, we start, it's very easy that all meat is just going to follow with that. And now we're at the place today, which is, I don't think people realize just how unusual our views about meat and saturated fat are in terms of human history. This is not something people have always believed. This is not the way people have always eaten by any stretch.
Yeah. Yeah, it's important to understand that history, right? Because then we know that our beliefs determine, how we behave and what we think and what we say. And so understanding that the cholesterol theory, the hypothesis already started from a bad background or a corrupted background. It's unfortunate to see that they took it and ran with it and they're still running with it. And it's just helpful to understand that. And I remember a previous podcast that you've been on. I'm not sure if you have the numbers off the top of your mind or if you're kind of referring to something, but you mentioned how the SDA, the Seventh Day Adventist Church, has such a big influence, right? They have control, or they own so many schools and spots, and determine like guidelines and influence. Do you have any of those numbers off the top of your head?
I think I do have some of these. If I can, if you have a moment for me to look them up.
Yeah, sure.
So,
One of the thing, oh, you have it
mhm.
already?
No, go
Okay, yeah.
ahead. Go ahead. I'm
Okay.
looking it
I
up.
was going to say, one of the things I wanted to mention that I learned from Dr. Chafee from just listening to one of his other talks is that the Seventh Day Adventist has a huge influence even on the integrative medicine program. So, like, for me to be able to learn a little bit more
Oh,
about
really?
functional medicine or integrative medicine, there are courses that I can take to learn more about that and pay for those modules. And apparently, Loma Linda is the university has a huge influence there. SDA has a huge influence in creating those programs, which are very, very plant based. So even if somebody wanted to learn how to approach medicine through a nutritional approach, it's still going to be skewed towards being plant based. So I think it's just good to be aware of that, just because I'm going to, aim to get some extra training in functional medicine or integrative medicine, that there is already a bias towards plant based medicine. That's how far it's like in attempt to take back health and nutrition, they already have affected that kind of training for doctors going forward.
Yeah. Wow. I totally believe that, because if I can get this pulled up, I'll tell you some of these numbers. But yeah, the Seventh Day Adventists own a lot of medical schools, as I'm sure people are familiar with, and they definitely do a lot more than just telling people not to eat meat. They're very health
Yeah.
focused, and this doesn't mean that all of it's bad. I mean, like Harvey Kellogg did a lot of great things with saunas, which I would still follow today. So definitely doesn't mean it's all bad, but I think it's so important for people to understand the bias that is so pervasive in what they teach, and they teach it to a lot of medical students, a lot of patients, and it has these religious beliefs at their base, which I could go into a lot of detail about why I don't believe those, and I don't believe that is a good interpretation of what we read about in Genesis or anything. But that really came first before the science.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let me try for just another moment to get this pulled up, and then let's see. So what I'll share with you, if I can get this pulled up, is that it's not just that they have Loma Linda University or anything. It's actually a lot
just the one
of
that comes to mind.
Schools. Yeah. That's the one people probably know of. But it's also radio stations, it's food companies, and this isn't just in the United States. This is all around the world. And they've had a huge influence in Australia, South America, Asia even, and then really took those ideas and then started doing a lot of the scientific research since then. So they're definitely still working on a lot of this. All right, let me see.
Yeah, and I was looking at our Canadian guidelines for just cholesterol and heart health, and I clicked the reference that they provide in terms of why we should be eating more plant-based, and that reference was the SDA study talking about how thousands of people, when they cut out red meat, or those who switched to red meat, had poor outcomes. And right then and there, it's a biased study. But a lot of people talk about how those in the SDA religion who eat meat are more likely to smoke, drive a motorcycle, do unhealthy things already. So it's not really, and I can't remember exactly the methods of that study, but that's the one they reference. I didn't see any other references, and I was shocked that they would just provide that one article, or to say eat plant based, it's good for your heart. And I'm like, it's a little bit
Wow.
biased.
Wow. Yeah, that's the big problem with the studies we see is they're mostly these epidemiological studies. And there's a huge problem with confounding factors there. So I'll read you some of these food companies first of all, and then I've got some stats here on just how big of an influence that the Seventh Day Adventist Church has had on our food today. So food companies that are started or owned or somehow affiliated with the Seventh Day Adventist Church. This is Kellogg's, Post, Kashi, Morningstar Farms, Little Debbie, Heartland Brands, Sunbelt Bakery, Fieldstone Bakery, Loma Linda Foods, Earth's Own, Worthington. And then there's more around the world, even the ones that are making foods you might recognize as typically Australian foods like Wheat Bix and Marmite. Those are all kind of serving this original purpose that they had of getting meat out of the diet. And as of 2017, Seventh Day Adventist Church managed 171 hospitals, 101 colleges and universities, 753 secondary schools, 329 clinics and dispensaries, 133 nursing homes, retirement centers, 21 orphanages, 24 food industries, over 60 publishing houses, over 400 TV stations, over 200 radio stations, altogether accounting for over 8,500 educational institutions, 2 million students, 17 million outpatient visits. So
Wow.
They're having a big influence. And, even now there's this new Netflix documentary that came out about the Blue Zone. Blue Zones LLC is owned by the Seventh Day Adventist Church, and they're writing books about it. I mean, obviously one of the big blue zones, right, is Loma Linda. But when we look into that, it's all about confounding factors and also the reality that a lot of these people who are actually really healthy and living so long, they're actually eating a lot more meat than these blue zones documentaries or books make it seem like. And there's a lot of great information out there that people really pick that apart and show all the issues with that.
Yeah, Dr. Chaffee interviewed somebody who went to one of the blue zones in Italy and got to spend a couple of days, or interviewed those people who were on these documentaries and books. And they shared that they actually eat a lot more meat than is reported. And like on a Sunday, they'll do a big cookout, like cook a whole lamb or pork or something like that. And they'll eat a little bit of meat throughout the entire week, including organ meats and things like that. But what's reported is that they eat meat like once a day. It's like, no, they cook it once, but they eat a little bit of meat every single day.
Oh,
but
interesting.
They leave that out. So it's a really good episode. And he talks about like they're in their 80s or 90s, but they're walking up and down a lot of stairs, a lot of steps. So they're also walking a lot. And Mike Mutzel on just YouTube, his podcast, he shared that one of the studies show that maybe it's not exactly the diet that is helping 100% to live long, but it's also the amount of activity they do. They walk a lot, and that's extremely beneficial too. Like it's a confounding variable that maybe isn't taken into consideration. So things to consider. You can't trust everything you read, and it's good to look into these things and have discussions, and it's okay to disagree with what's being said, to try to find out the truth.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I'd love for you to touch on, which is very common in Christianity, I guess, in reading scripture, you mentioned that God told us to eat ruminants, or told Israel, and but then he also commands them what not to eat, like shellfish and pork. Could you maybe tell the listeners what scripture says in terms of what not to eat, maybe why they shouldn't have eaten it? Is it because they're more likely to get diseases, parasites, for example, and that it would transmit to humans a little bit easier? And then where in the New Testament, does the New Testament say anything in regards to being okay in eating pork and other foods like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, the dietary laws, pork is the big one we think of. It says don't eat pigs. But shellfish, any kind of carnivorous animals or bottom feeders, those were all the birds, fish, bugs you weren't supposed to eat. So there's a lot we can learn from that today. I think part of it is just something eating an unclean diet is going to be unclean food for us, not just from a spiritual perspective, but there's implications of what we eat, what they eat. And I think a big implication of that for us today is, what is the diet of the animals we are eating? Because today I think we have a lot bigger concerns than the fact that an oyster is filtering seawater. Today we have the concern that your pig in a confinement feeding operation is eating all that junk and all that unnatural diet that we talked about with the cows a little bit earlier. So I think that is a good reason for us to be concerned with the diets of the animals we're eating from a health perspective. And like we said, it's not the biggest concern, especially with ruminants. It's not a reason to eat less meat, but there's definitely some evidence there that this is something that affects our health, and it is something we should be paying attention to. The food that our food eats, it matters. I think a lot of those laws were about disease risk. Pigs are similar enough to humans. I mean, this is why we can use certain pig organs in human transplants, right? Pigs are fairly similar to humans, and because of that, there's diseases that can pass easily between pigs and humans. So some of that was just concern with the diseases. But I think it created a culture where they focused on cleaner, less risky, more nutritious animals overall, because they were, okay, we're not going to raise pigs, we're going to go raise goats, which are ruminant. And so all of those commands in the Old Testament, when I talk about these, I'm always talking about what are the health implications for us today? What can we learn from them today? The New Testament makes it very clear that Christians are not still held to these laws. And I understand there are some Christians who would disagree with that, but what I'm talking about here is Jesus said it is not what goes into a person, it's what comes out of a person that makes them unclean. And then it very specifically says, by this, Jesus declared all foods clean. We have a really, really interesting story in Acts where Peter he's sitting on the roof of his house, he's praying, and God comes to him in a vision and shows him all of these unclean animals and says, Peter, get up and eat these unclean animals. And Peter is sitting there on the roof trying to figure out, why would God tell me to do this? I've never eaten an unclean animal before. What is the purpose of this? And as Peter is sitting there, the servants of a Roman centurion, so a Gentile, not held to these dietary laws, they come up to his house and say, our master, Cornelius, this Gentile centurion, wants you to come to his house and tell him the gospel, basically. And so Peter gets down, he goes to his house, he preaches the gospel to his family, and Cornelius and his family often consider the first Gentile converts to Christianity in this area. So the point of that whole story is that a Jew very devoutly following the Jewish dietary laws probably would not even have gone into a Gentile's house because of their unclean food. But now there's something more important than that, which is go and preach the gospel to everybody. And that does not mean that there were not still good health reasons for following the dietary laws. There was just something more important. So I think the application of that for us today is that I want to make sure I'm not ever letting my food choices keep me from these other good things that have been commanded, which is community and hospitality and witnessing to people. My concern now isn't that I'm going to go into someone's house and they're going to be cooking pork, but I'm not going to skip Bible study because they're having a potluck and serving food I don't want to eat. There's a lot I can do to still make my own good food choices while I'm there, but I'm not going to isolate myself. I'm not going to be judgmental. I'm not going to never invite people over to my house or never go over to other people's houses because my food choices get in the way with that. So that's what I learned from that. But there's several other verses in the New Testament that talk about how, the law was fulfilled. And when we look at these verses in the Old Testament, it's for health reasons. It's what are the practical things we can take away from that. It's not because we're still held to these or even any food laws, is what I teach.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. I know there's disagreements, but there's also, I think you provide a lot of clarity for those who maybe haven't looked into this as much. One of the topics I heard you on a previous podcast as well is acknowledging the importance of how life comes from death. Like, it's necessary to have death. There's no free lunch, so as to say. Whether you're eating plants or animals, something has to die so that you can continue living. And that is part of the broken world that we live in. Previously, before the fall, there would have been no death because no sin existed. But shortly after verse 2, there's verse 3, and there is the fall of the world. And would you be able to touch on that topic briefly?
Yeah, exactly. So, I mentioned earlier that the Seventh Day Adventists drew a lot of these beliefs from this idea that the Garden of Eden was vegetarian, right? People were not eating meat back then. There was no death. But that's just not the reality of the world we live in anymore. And I don't believe we see anywhere in the Bible that we're called to try to recreate the Garden of Eden in that way. What we see all throughout the Bible since the fall is that, just like you said, death is required for life. We see this in that Adam and Eve were evicted from the garden. They were cut off from the tree of life, and which is usually understood to mean that is what would have given them eternal life. That's what would have made their situation permanent. So they were exiled, doomed to death in a physical sense, for the purpose of God's whole redemptive plan of eternal life, which is what we see much later on in the Bible. We see this in the sacrifices, Old Testament sacrifices, that animals had to be killed in order for their sins to be covered. The passages that talk about Passover talk about this really clearly. You must kill a lamb. You must eat the whole lamb. Which, oh, by the way, they could not have followed those commandments if they were not eating lamb. But that death was required for them to live. And ultimately, we see this with Jesus' sacrifice. John 3:16 is probably what makes this most clear, that Jesus died so that we could be saved and have eternal life with God. And we even just see that in the reality of the world we live in, that animals and plants have to die and decompose into soil so that new plants can grow and feed other animals and feed us so we can live. And we know that there are animals, for example, that are carnivores that have to eat other animals to survive. So we know that in the Garden of Eden, things were very fundamentally different somehow about, a leopard, like we think of a leopard today, did not exist like that in the Garden of Eden, because that whole animal is built around being a carnivore, right? Something was fundamentally different back then about plants, about animals. What a lot of people don't realize is that humans are also one of God's creatures that has to eat animal foods to survive. It's not just that animal foods are the best protein and good nutrition. There's certain nutrients we can only get from animal foods that we need to survive. And I always get so annoyed when I see these recommendations about, if it's something you see in medical school, advocating a plant-based diet or something. They never mention that. You literally cannot survive long-term without supplementing if you're going to do that. But anyway, the point is that we need these animal nutrients to survive. I really think we need them to live optimally, in a much broader sense. And I really believe that if we try to shortcut this reality that death is required for life, all that's going to happen is we are going to end up finding death some way or another, whether it's through the slow decline of our health or whether it is through a lot of unintentional death we don't see. Because people want to think that they go eat beans instead of a beef burger, that nothing died on their plate. But the reality is that a lot of small animals die in the process of our modern plant agriculture. Probably fair to say that many more animals actually die making these plant crops, especially these protein replacements that we eat now, instead of killing a large animal like a cow, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't necessarily see that, but it's what's still happening, and it's unavoidable. This if we talk about regenerative agriculture, which is really what I believe is God's design for getting back to this symbiotic relationship between animals and plants and healthy creation, healthy soils. Animals are required to be part of that process. You absolutely cannot have that without animals. Plants have to be part, or animals have to be part of that. And that's just the reality of the world we live in today.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a common argument that vegetarianism or veganism doesn't cause a lot of death, but definitely if you go by numbers and if you look at the facts, it definitely does impact a lot of animals' lives. And it's, I guess, blissful ignorance at the best there, trying to just not look at it, trying to put the blame on ruminants and everything else. So that's a whole other topic that people can get into. But I think it's important to acknowledge that regardless of what you eat, something has to die for the other thing to live. And we see that evidently in nature. If you watch any National Geographic, a lot of people can't stomach a National Geographic because of the carnivores eating the herbivores. And that's just life. And I think we're desensitized to a lot of it, right? Like we expect just life to be very clean. There's no blood, no death, but in real life, it is brutal when you consider what a bear has to do to live, a wolf, and so on. And it's just part of life that we have to accept. I want you to. I'm kind of debating how many topics we discuss, but I think since I have you here, I think it'd be beneficial for you just to touch on the vegetable oils. We talked about the word processed, and this is an area of contention. I think there's still people that would say that vegetable oils are heart healthy, depending if you have them cold versus fried or boiling, right? And so, what have you learned from your research and experience?
Yes, I would hate to finish this podcast without talking about vegetable oils because this is one of my favorite topics. So I mentioned earlier this concept of human dominion and what good human dominion over food can look like. Well, I certainly think there's bad human dominion over food as well. And what I think that looks like is it's not necessarily any processing, because like I said, even cooking, fermentation, those are processes. That's processing food. But the bad processed foods, in terms of bad for us, or again, not morally bad, but bad for us, this is what I would think of as examples of poor human dominion over food, which to me means we've taken something in God's creation and we've taken away from it, or we've used it to try to replace something that was good in God's creation. And I truly believe that by far the best example of that is these vegetable oils. So a truly processed food in a negative sense that is bad for us, a food that is an example of poor human dominion over creation. Because how these vegetable oils came to be such a big part of our diet is during the Industrial Revolution, basically we had these waste products of other industries and other oils that were being used for things like machine lubricant. And they were able to take these industrial processes that didn't used to exist and use these to essentially detoxify these to the point that they were not acutely toxic to humans and create this new food, brand new food, never been eaten before in human history. And then when we started getting scared of saturated fat, these really became the replacement. Vegetable oils. So what we're talking about here, this is the canola oil, corn oil, soybean oil, not truly actually vegetable oil is kind of a euphemism. These don't come from
Mhm.
vegetables, they come from seeds. These are all actually seed oils. And the problem with them is they're very high in polyunsaturated fats. It's kind of the opposite of an animal fat, which is going to be much higher in saturated fat. And these polyunsaturated fats are much more unstable if you look at how they're made up molecularly. And that means that under any kind of heat, just over time, exposed to sunlight, those are going to become damaged. And when those polyunsaturated fats become damaged, they end up creating these toxic byproducts that are going to create oxidative damage in our body. And so, some people will say, oh, well, you just maybe a cold pressed canola oil or something. But the problem is that these go through such an extensive processing, even just to be created, that they are already damaged when we get them. And it can be cold pressed, it can be, it doesn't really matter to me how it's created. All of these are foods that we should be avoiding for our health. They're all going to be damaged. They're all going to be creating damage in our body when we eat them. And certainly something that comes out of a deep fryer, that's going to be the worst, because that has been repeatedly heated. That is going to be the most damaged of all. But none of these are foods that I would think we should be eating. And I really like people to understand what it is about processed food that makes it bad and what kind of processed food really is bad, because that's one of those dogmatic terms that I don't think always serves us well. It's true that most of what we think of as processed food is indeed foods that we'd be better off avoiding, but what is it that really makes processed food bad? Well, by far the biggest thing is these vegetable oils. What we think of as processed foods are almost always made with these vegetable oils, and that's what's causing the most harm from them. And avoiding these, this is the number one priority in my diet from a health perspective. We don't hear about these a lot still. Like you said, it's still controversial. But the reason that we're so hung up and it's so hard to recognize how harmful these are is because we're still so hung up on saturated fat. These are the opposite of saturated fat. Until we recognize that saturated fat is natural God-given fat, it's the natural fat, and we're willing to accept that, eating more saturated fat, eating more cholesterol, not actually what causes heart disease or any kind of health problem. Until we recognize that, we're going to have a very hard time accepting how harmful these vegetable oils are. But the science is out there. There's a study I was just looking at talking about the aldehyde exposure from these vegetable oils. So aldehydes are some of the toxic byproducts that come from the oxidation of these vegetable oils. Okay, aldehydes are also what makes smoking harmful. It's why smoking causes heart disease, right? And there are comparisons showing that something that comes out of a fryer with vegetable oil, so for example, French fries, is giving you the same toxic aldehyde exposure as smoking all day long. And that is so hard for people to wrap their brains around, because we're so used to thinking of smoking as dirty and it's bad for you, and everyone's on board with that now, right?
Yep.
But eating French fries is so normal, right? Like, surely that's not that bad for you. But when we actually look at the science, you are getting the same toxicity from a 5-ounce serving of French fries as you are from something like 20 cigarettes or something. It's just crazy.
Wow. Would you mind sending me the link to that so I can put it in the description for people who want to take a look at it?
Yeah, I will. Dr. Kate Shanahan is a medical doctor who has a lot of good information about this, and she has an article where she references that study and that researcher, and I will send you that because it's a great article. I wish everyone would go read. And then if you want, you can of course go look at the scientific study as well that talks about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
So I just wish I could make everyone understand how toxic these are. And if I were to tell everybody one thing they could do to improve their health, it would be start reading the ingredients, start looking for these, replace them with better fats, cook your own food when you have to. Think about how much food you eat out at restaurants has these. And it really takes reframing your thinking, not just about saturated fat and heart-healthy vegetable oils, but also about the fact that not everything, we might think that, Chipotle sounds like a healthy option, right? It's like better fast food. Well, everything they're serving is still cooked in vegetable oils. You can't assume that just because something fits into this dogmatic idea of fast food or processed food, that's what makes it bad and everything else is good. You've got to understand what's really in it. You've got to be able to think through that yourself and make your own decision.
Yeah. Yeah. Understanding that process, how food came to be. And at this point, it's you kind of have to, it's important to understand the mechanisms, which is weird to say for the average person to have to at least be aware of some of the mechanisms, because that's doctor stuff, that's nutritional therapist stuff, right? To understand how certain things influence the body. But if you want to really convince yourself of why, or understand why something is bad, it's important to know how it interacts with your body and your cells. On the topic of vegetable oils, I just wanted to mention, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I think a lot of anecdotal evidence, I'm not sure if there's research evidence, says that people that cut out vegetable oils tend to burn less in the sun. And I think one of the reason there too is because the cholesterol, or your cell membrane, your lipid bilayer, is made out of cholesterol, which makes it, or unsaturated fat, which makes it more fluid. As soon as you start introducing, I think, the polyunsaturated fat, which the structure is different, makes the cell less fluid, which affects how it interacts in your body, and probably affects how your body reacts to sunlight. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So I had mentioned briefly earlier that one of the things that damages these vegetable oils is being exposed to sunlight, right? So the fat you eat makes up the fat in your skin. We have a lot of fat in our skin, just like any animal. You eat the skin on the chicken, that's where all the fat is. So the fat we eat, it ends up making up the fat in our bodies. They can do biopsies and tests and see how much of your fat, what percentage of it is polyunsaturated fat, and it has gone up a lot since people have started eating all these vegetable oils. But that just means when you're exposed to sun, those fats are going to oxidize and get damaged just the same way a vegetable oil would that you might be eating. And so, yes, a ton of anecdotal evidence. And I'm also not sure what is out there in terms of if anyone's ever done a study on this, but tons of anecdotal evidence that people who cut these out stop getting burned as easily. That's been my experience. I got really, really serious about cutting these out. For a long time, I was not cooking with these, but when I really started thinking about reading ingredients on everything, and for the most part just stopped going to restaurants for this purpose, and I really got serious about cutting these out. Yeah, I do not get sunburn as easily. My toddler, who's really never eaten these at all, she is strawberry blonde, like as fair as can be, and she is so tolerant of the sun.
Wow.
I'm sure she's out there sometimes. Other kids would just be frying, and she's fine. I've never put sunscreen on her.
Interesting.
I take her, and I don't try to keep her out of the sun either. She's fine.
Okay. The next topic I wanted to talk about, which I've seen you post and share about, which is controversial. I mean, everything we're talking about can be seen as controversial, but this one is raw milk. Because in Canada, it's a banned substance. We can't get raw milk unless we go across the border. It's probably easier to get street drugs than it is to get raw milk. And in preparation for our talk, I just went on CDC, or try to find some information on CDC in regards to it. And this is a quote that I got. Raw milk and products can be contaminated with bacteria that cause serious illness, hospitalization, or even death. From 1998 through 2011, 148 outbreaks due to the consumption of raw milk or their products were reported to CDC. So 148. These resulted in 2,384 illnesses, 284 hospitalizations, and 2 deaths. So doesn't sound like much compared to other things that can happen in terms of infectious disease. But I guess it's severe enough that they find They want to protect the public from being exposed to raw milk. And they found the correlation that whenever they legalize it, there's an increase in infectious diseases. But in terms of hospitalizations, that can be pretty bad. 2 deaths. I don't want to minimize that. It's important. You don't want to die. But it is only 2 from 1998 to 2011. What do you say to patients or clients, people who are interested in drinking raw milk but are afraid of it? A lot of people that would be listening to their conversation right now can be doctors, my colleagues or my supervisors, and other people who just, just what they learn from online and research is like, raw milk is bad. I don't even want to play with it. It's not worth it. Just drink the pasteurized. It's safer, which I 100%, I can sympathize and I agree with. I haven't tasted raw milk, so I don't really lean towards one way. I'm just interested in learning what you say.
I think that the important thing is to understand the difference in where it comes from, because this was the only reason that this whole fear of raw milk arose in the first place around the time of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, before that, people always drank their milk fresh, what we call raw now, and that was no big deal. But what happened is that when people started moving more into cities, these dairies got moved into cities in these very, very unsanitary conditions. Probably not even anything we would see today. It started becoming contaminated. It's not a surprise at all. And even now, I wouldn't want to drink raw milk if it came from a cow from a conventional dairy. But if you have a cow that's living the way God intended a cow to live, it's outside, it's eating grass, it has space, it's being taken care of, it's healthy, then this is not like raw chicken or something. This is a completely different thing. And, if we really think about what those numbers that you just said mean in terms of the huge scope and millions of billions of people, it's nothing compared to illnesses that come from like salad lettuce and stuff. But I think people also need to just understand, like, raw milk is not just like this like fun thing we're messing around with. This is like a superfood. I think of raw milk as a superfood the same way I would think of beef liver or something. Completely different food than pasteurized milk in terms of the nutrition, in terms of protecting you against allergic reactions to it. Raw milk has lactase in it. People who are lactose intolerant, they go take lactase pills. Raw milk has lactase, but that enzyme gets killed off when you pasteurize it. Very nutritious, really so much evidence, and this is even in the scientific literature, of how it's going to help with allergies and digestive problems and all kinds of things. And it's so unfortunate that we have taken this fear, which arose from unsanitary conditions, which are really not our concern anymore, especially if you're getting raw milk from the places raw milk usually comes from, which is small, clean farms, and that we have completely sacrificed how beneficial this food can be out of these acute fears. And even a lot of the propaganda, is really the right word for it, that was used at the time when to first make raw milk illegal in all these places in Canada and a lot of US states. We know now that a lot of that was completely made up. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but there is a lot there to how certain medical companies got involved in this. And you just have to ask, why were they making up these news articles that we know now are completely fabricated to try to restrict this? And what a lot of it actually comes back to is just the fact that pasteurization is a process that really helps large dairies, because small dairies don't always have the capacity to be able to comply with the pasteurization laws. So I think you could make the case that a lot of this push for making raw milk illegal, a lot of the artificial fear that was created about raw milk, was about just benefiting these large industries and getting rid of all the small industries. I live in New Jersey, which used to have a lot of small dairies. And you can tell this because you drive around and these towns are named things like Cream Ridge and things like that. And today, New Jersey has one of the single worst raw milk laws in the whole United States. It's essentially like Canada, where it's just completely illegal, no way around it. I mean, fortunately, we live close enough to Pennsylvania and other places that it's not too hard to go drive and get it if you want it. But it makes you wonder, is there a correlation between the fact that New Jersey has these extremely restrictive laws and the fact that there used to be a lot of small dairies here also? I don't think that's a coincidence.
Yeah, that's news to me. I didn't know that that pasteurization process would definitely make it challenging for the smaller businesses to function. And here in Canada, I know I have some friends whose family members own a dairy farm, and they say that they can't even give away or share raw milk unless it's within like their primary family. And if the cows produce too much, they just have to dump thousands of liters or gallons down the drain because it's illegal for other people to have that. And so it's unfortunate, because when we talk about stewarding what God has given us, we are literally just pouring nutrition down the drain because of politics in a way, right? And so it's
Wow.
very sad to hear that.
That's very sad.
But so thank you for shedding light on that. I think a lot of people don't even know that raw milk is a thing, unless you're kind of in this nutritional space. And it's nice to have a little bit more clarity and understanding kind of like maybe the background politics that happens. In doing some reading on your website, I came across a couple of topics that you tend to talk about with your clients from your training, such as, this is just so everybody listening is aware, in case they do want to reach out to you, is fertility, hormones, sleep, weight loss, exercise, fasting. You talk about acne, meal plans, diet tracking, supplements, and more. Out of those, the three that really stand out to me that I would appreciate you to touch on would be hormones, fertility, and sleep. I think a lot of people are interested in hormones, how to optimize it, and nutrition is very important for that. I have gotten male patients asking me to check their testosterone or maybe consider hormone treatment, checking it for fatigue. Sleep is like 50 to 70% of people, I feel. People are struggling with sleep. A lot of people on sleep medications, and some people that don't want the meds are open to supplements, and then I'll suggest some and providing some research behind that. And then fertility is a big one too. Over the last many years, it seems like fertility has been decreasing, both on the women's side and the guy side, with low sperm motility, and hormones being impacted. So I would love to just kind of give you free reign to just touch on like hormones, fertility, and sleep, so that the viewer listening and myself, so that I can become a little bit more educated when I discuss this with patients in the future, how we can all benefit from improving those factors in our life.
Yeah, these are really interesting to me because like some of these are ones actually, all three of those that you mentioned are things I've dealt with personally. And my certification is not any kind of medical licensure. I don't take labs. I'm not super well versed on reading labs, but the approach I like to take is, the more I learn about nutrition, the more I actually get away from the kind of bio-individual approach. And I tend to think that the same kind of things are actually just ideal for all humans. A really nutrient-dense diet, cutting down on anti-nutrients, getting rid of inflammatory foods like vegetable oils. So there's definitely ways that all of those things end up relating. Good nutrition, we can just go crazy trying to track down all the different little ways that this nutrient helps this and that and that. Or we could just say, eat organs, eat meat, eat a really nutrient-dense diet, cut down on the anti-nutrients that are preventing you from getting a nutrient-dense diet. And that's just going to do so many things we don't even understand. And you hear those kind of stories too. People, I started putting liver in my diet and I just didn't even know why, but it helps this or that. And so I certainly like talking about the kind of general diet approach that's going to, I think, help with all of these things. But there's also some really specific things that come in. Stress is a big one with hormones, with fertility, with sleep. Stress is going to be a really big one. Identifying what those kind of stressors actually could be. It could be things you don't even think of as stressors, like mold exposure or any kind of toxic exposure. For me, it was, I think for a long time, I had a lot of chronic stress from over-exercising. I was a marathon runner. I was training for ultra marathons. And even just being in my time in the military was a lot of chronic stress. And that has affected, thyroid is a big thing that gets affected from stress. But thyroid also gets affected from exposure to toxins like chlorine and fluoride. And so sometimes you can just talk to people and they'll tell you very interesting things like, oh yeah, I was on swim team for a long time. And you think, well, maybe you got so much chlorine that's displacing all the iodine in your thyroid. They're both halogens, so that can happen. And maybe that's why you have thyroid problems. That's one I keep seeing crop up just recently, so that comes to mind. So when I'm talking to people about those kind of things, I like to try to track down what are the possible sources of your stress. Light exposure is a big one for sleep. Are you looking at blue light late at night? There's ways EMF can come in and be concerning in terms of toxic exposure for all of these things. For fertility, I think, the stress and the thyroid connection is big, but that's also a metabolic problem for a lot of people. And this is why I've seen keto be super successful for a lot of people with fertility, is because if they can just get off that blood sugar, insulin, crazy metabolic problem that they have, all of a sudden PCOS can reverse itself extremely fast from what I've seen if people can just get their metabolic problems under control. But then it's also important to understand that metabolic problems are probably at their root caused by polyunsaturated fat. It's not a carb sugar issue at its root cause. So again, it all kind of comes back dietarily to some of these fundamentals that we've already talked about. But yeah, it's, with all of those, I just like to try to talk to people and try to track down some of those root causes. And a lot of times you can do that. You don't necessarily have to take a lot of labs. You don't necessarily have to do a food sensitivity test and try to cut out a lot of food sensitivities if you're looking at this bigger picture.
Yeah. And I appreciate you sharing that, because I think a lot of people, including myself, can get pretty excited about all this like biohacking, ordering labs to figure out exactly what your hormones are, or nutrient deficiencies. But at the end of the day, if you want to save money and just do the work instead of kind of like pretending or fantasizing, it's almost like the best way to be productive is just to do, right? Instead of just sit down and planning. I think we get stuck in the planning and theorizing that you should just do. And so the doing that we discussed is, get out, get sunlight, eat meat, eat your vegetables, don't eat processed things, don't eat processed seed oils or carbohydrates, don't drink your sugar. Those things will take you a long way, and it'll help you with sleep and help you with stress, and try to improve your sleep and decrease your stress, which is huge. And if you do that, you will benefit. And if you don't, then at that point, it's good to start kind of troubleshooting. Maybe I should see my doctor and see if there's anything internally that's is making the hormones difficult to get themselves in order, right? And at that point, it's beneficial. To mention the PCOS thing, is I noticed, unfortunately, a couple of patients that I've just seen, or when shadowing doctors, they'll mention that they have PCOS as if it's a sentence, like there's no way to improve it. And it breaks my heart, because I don't, like you said, nutritionally, there is a way to improve it and reverse it by decreasing that insulin. Is that the only way? I'm not sure. It's something that I will continue to learn about, as I have to and will do for my patients. But I know that at least the starting point is nutritional therapy. And it always breaks my heart when a patient says, I have certain condition, as if there's no way out of it, and like they're stuck. And it's like, don't identify with that. There is a way to improve your life. And I'm glad that you mentioned that people can reverse their PCOS.
Yeah, that's really good. I love that. Don't identify with it, because there usually is something that can be done.
A couple of things I just want to mention. It might seem small, but it makes sense for me. Many minutes ago, when we were talking about eating meat, and I mentioned Genesis, I said verse 3. I meant chapter 3. That's when the fall happens, because I know people nitpick in the comment section. So I'm correcting myself. A fun fact that I just wanted to share with you and the listeners is I know I've heard Dr. Chafee mention this, and I listen to his podcast. That's probably why I mention him a lot. But he's mentioned there's research based on telomeres that say that our life expectancy, or max life, is about 120 years. And it's interesting considering when you go to Genesis after the flood, God limits our life to 120 years. So since we're talking about biblical perspective, I think it's a nice fun fact to mention. And then a couple of quick questions, and then we'll wrap up here is, what are some tools or resources that you use, if any, to either, track your productivity or your food intake or exercise? Like, is there any kind of fun app that you have that you think maybe people benefit, or it's just pretty intuitive? You just eat what you know is right and do what's right.
Yeah, honestly, not really. I
Okay.
think one of these things I go to the more I learn is just kind of this intuitive approach. If I really think if you know what real foods are, you're preparing them well, you're really only giving yourself the option of these real foods, I think you can be really intuitive. And I don't have any specific health problems right now that I'm having to work on that means I need to go track my food or anything. There certainly is a time and place for that. But for me, for my kid, um, yeah, I don't have any reason to make it more complicated right now.
Yeah, makes sense. What are
Mhm.
3 traits of someone who is unstoppable?
Mm. I think a big one that comes to mind first is taking responsibility. If you're trying to put the blame on someone else and something else, circumstances might make you feel better, but that's as far as it's going to go. Taking responsibility. Um, I think I think being I mentioned earlier trying to think of creative solutions. That's something that has helped me a lot. Not just limiting myself because this is the way it has to be done, or this is the way it's always been done. Um, that has been big for me, and I think too, being willing to ask, just being willing to ask for things. Uh, I have had a lot of opportunities that I probably should not have been able to have because I've just gone out and asked.
Mm,
And you make it easy for someone to say yes. I had someone who told me once, don't accept no from someone who doesn't have the authority to also tell you yes. And you just go out and keep asking those questions, and I think people would be really surprised sometimes. I have surprised myself with what I've been able to do and the opportunities I've been able to have.
yeah, for sure, agree. So taking responsibility, being creative, and being willing to ask for things.
Mhm.
Those are really good traits for somebody who wants to be unstoppable. And one thing that we mentioned right at the beginning that I just didn't want to miss here is when we were talking about carnivore, you said there's definitely times when it can be beneficial to just eat meat. And then there's times where it's good to just eat a little bit of everything. Do you remember
Mhm.
that's what you said? And then any specific instances where you would say, for this person, carnivore would be good for a season, and for other people, not so much?
Yeah, absolutely. So autoimmune conditions and digestive conditions are where carnivore is going to be extremely beneficial. But I think the main reason it's beneficial, well, there's several things going on. You're getting a lot of meat. A lot of people are also including organs, but also a huge factor is you are just cutting out these anti-nutrients in your diet. You're completely cutting out the anti-nutrients. It seems to have huge tie-ins with autoimmunity, with digestive problems. So a lot of people can get those same benefits just by identifying what the high anti-nutrient foods in their diets are. A lot of those are
Hmm.
vegetables, or grains that are not properly prepared, like we talked about. And so you can get a lot of those same benefits just by properly preparing your grains, not eating, the wrong raw vegetables or whatever. But if someone has a really serious autoimmune condition, a really serious digestive problem, that's someone who I might say go on a carnivore diet temporarily, and you're probably going to see results really fast.
Okay, I appreciate you sharing that. And what
Mhm.
are some ways that people can get in touch with you? Maybe you can take this time to kind of pitch yourself and let people know what you talk about, and then your Instagram handle and your website.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so I mentioned briefly earlier that I've been teaching some classes for churches, church groups. I'm working right now on a whole new kind of revamped class, really focusing from the starting point of how do we eat for the glory of God, but then also going into all the really practical information that people want, trying to put those two things together. And that is something that I hope to be offering soon when I have that together as a class that could be that I can teach in person, that I can teach remotely, but also course materials that someone who wants to go teach their small group, teach a group of their friends, that they can use these course materials I've already created. That was the feedback I got at the last conference I was at, is that there's a lot of people out here who are like, I want to go teach my friends about this. I want to teach my church
Hmm.
about this. The health conditions they're suffering from are heartbreaking, and I want to be able to go tell them about these things that have helped me. Well, if I've already created course materials and put a lot of time and effort and research into these course materials I've already created, I want them to be able to, if that's something they can use, to be able to go use that themselves and not have to recreate the wheel, do it all on their own. And then I'm also working on using that same kind of material and just making a devotional that someone could go through. If that's a better format, is doing a devotional just themselves or with a small group. So hoping to have those out soon. And I'm on Instagram at it's Taste and See Biblical Nutrition, and that is Taste and See _ Biblical Nutrition. So that's where I'm on Instagram, but also have a website which is just Taste and See Biblical Nutrition.com, all one word. And I'm really transitioning to trying to post more information on my website and through periodic emails, not every day, but maybe like once a week, because I could just go into more depth there. I think that's a little bit better format than social media for some of the more in-depth information I'm sharing. And that's how
Hmm.
I can notify people when the course is ready, when the devotional is ready. So those are the two big areas where I would love to have, if any of that interests someone, to have them follow on Instagram or check out my website and subscribe on there. And then I can keep them up to date with those coming out, and just the other things I'm researching, and this kind of information that we talked about here.
Great. I'll put those links in the description to make it easier for people to click. Um, we talked about so much, and I know there's more we can discuss. And one topic that I'll leave for maybe a future interview with you, just to give people time to digest this information. And I'm sure there will be questions, but one that I'm interested in the future is maybe you could talk about raising kids as
Mm.
animal based or from a biblical perspective, and we can tackle how do you often make their meals and talk more about that sun exposure and not using sunscreen. So it'd just be interesting to hear from your perspective what you've been doing differently. And I think a lot of people have been want to do that or trying to do that, and providing some guidance and personal experience is always beneficial to see how you do it.
Yeah, I would love to talk about that. Um, my first priority in what I do is being a stay-at-home mom for my kids, and second kids on the way. So even the course and everything I'm developing is slow going because I stay home with my kids.
Yeah.
But yeah, so much of what I do is geared towards how do I take care of my family, and I think that's a motivation for a lot of people who get into this. And it has been very encouraging for me so far to see, I put a lot of effort into making our own food from scratch, getting toxins out of our homes. Like I put a lot of time and effort and money into that. But it has been encouraging for me to see so far how I believe that has, by God's grace and His provision, has benefited my kids and my pregnancy right now and everything. And it's been worthwhile for sure.
Good. So we'll leave that topic for another time because I'm sure people want to hear some more. And just for everybody
Great.
listening, I'm gonna mention a feature that I haven't used before but exists. Is if you have any questions, obviously drop them in the comments. But I'm gonna put a link for people to ask questions on Anchor, which is where I upload this, and then also I think Riverside FM is how we're recording this. You can submit questions directly to myself, so that I can see it. And then maybe next time I interview Kat, we can go through some of those questions, because they'll be very specific to our conversation today. Well, I think that is all I have here. Just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Kat, thank you so much for your time, for answering all those questions and providing a lot of wisdom that you've learned through experience, through reading God's words, through prayer. And I'm excited to know somebody who is trying to look at nutrition from a biblical perspective. And you're creating resources that make it easier for other people to learn, apply, and teach that as well.
Well, thanks, Tiago. And thanks so much for everything you're doing as well, especially as a medical doctor. I think you have a huge impact into this podcast, and I'm really encouraged to see that.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Take care and have a good day.
You too.